The first in our interview series, I'm joined by Mairi Millar, who's the Clerk to the City of Glasgow Licensing Board and Head of the Council's Licensing and Democratic Services. Mairi, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. How are you?
Thanks, Jack. I'm well, thanks. Working from home as always at the moment.
Good job. Good to be talking to you. And the overarching theme of this series is lockdown licensing, the effect of the pandemic on all of us involved in the licensing process. I know that the Glasgow Licensing Board is troubled by the effect of the pandemic on the city's hospitality businesses. If you're in parts of the city centre at the moment, it's got this ghastly post-apocalyptic feel. I see places that are boarded up, that are probably mothballed, might never reopen. Other places are the lights on, but it's simply so that people can come in for takeaways. And the ongoing effect on the city's economy must be massive. As to the effect on the trade, I mean, there's no shortage of horrific descriptions, devastating, existential threat, facing oblivion, facing a reset, won't recover. So it's horrible. But I understand that the licensing board wrote to the government and expressing its concerns about how this was affecting Glasgow, as it will be other cities, of course. Can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, I mean, just as you've said there, Jack, the licensing board are hugely concerned about the impact that this is having on the hospitality trade within Glasgow. I think, it's a well-known fact that it's a huge contributor to the city's economy, and particularly the city centre area, which has, as you know, been so badly hit by COVID. Footfall has just obviously fallen off a cliff, and with the restrictions that have been in place over the last few months with the curfew, the temporary restrictions, the circuit breaker, and now the fact that we've moved into level 4, the licensing board have a really huge concern that we're just not going to see the trade pick back up. And they're really keen to do whatever they can to support that recovery process for the trade. And they did want to write to the government to express those concerns. But I think in doing so, they recognise the real challenge that the Scottish Government have in this process. I mean, ultimately, the public health must come first. And I think they understand that it has been necessary to have restrictions. But I think that they want to look ahead, look forward to how some of those restrictions that have been put in place, particularly around the curfew, some of the earlier restrictions around only allowing the cafes to operate, how those might be changed and modified to allow for that recovery process to start, given how important the trade is to the city. And I think that has been largely influenced by conversations that I know a number of the members have had with trade representatives over the whole COVID period. So I think they're very much in touch with just how difficult and the catastrophic effect that this has had. And I think they just want to make sure that they're doing all that they can to raise awareness of the impact that it's had on the trade in Glasgow. So they were very keen to write to the First Minister on all of those issues.
It's also jobs, of course, isn't it? Because we'll be getting some hard figures from the Scottish Licensed Trade Association in the next interview in the series. But apart from jobs, there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the hospitality industry and other sectors like, security staff, suppliers, food businesses, cleaners, any number of people. And that's all part of this kind of disaster package. From licensing point of view, what steps has the board taken to alleviate some of the pressures insofar as it can do so, just make it a bit easier?
I think that's probably the key, in so much as the board can do. I mean, they don't have the power to really fix a lot of the issues which the trade are facing. But what they have been very clear to me is that where we can loosen that regulatory red tape to make processes easier for the trade, to allow for temporary changes to licences, they've been very keen to do that. And I think even right from the start of the process, when we look back to the initial lockdown stages, where you had a number of premises which perhaps didn't have things like off sales on their licence. They were very keen that we allowed for things like the temporary minor variations, which essentially we have created that process to allow premises to very quickly add additional facilities onto the licence, which you and I would normally take a period of some months. And that process, that the board have been really keen to hear from the likes of yourself and other agents, what can we do around those regulatory processes just to remove some of those hurdles and timescales that the trade would normally have to deal with in making changes to the licences. They want to be able to respond to the changing environment that premises are facing. But I think they do so in recognition that it is probably only a very small part. And you mentioned there about jobs. I think that has been front and foremost at the minds of the board, that they want to do whatever they can to try and support the thousands of jobs which are tied up with the on-trade in the city.
One of the relaxations was the ability to do off sales by means of this alternative variation procedure, if I can call it that way.
That's very creative.
Rather than just what would normally be a major variation, which is quite a sort of lengthy process. So that led to the takeaway pints for Agro. And just to put that in context, the board, as I understand it, wasn't happy with people who were doing off sales by selling, beer, for example, in coffee-style cups with lids, and that seemed to be, really quite a sort of big issue. What was the board thinking about that?
I think, like myself, the board recognised that premises were just doing it probably as a mode of survival at that point, particularly during when the heaviest lockdown restrictions were in place. So it's not been a criticism of premises for resorting to selling the takeaway pints, but the board had to take into account the feedback it was getting. We talk a lot about local knowledge, but the board members were very aware of how that facility, what impact it was having in particular local communities. And we saw an awful lot around things like Kelvin Grove Park in the summer. But I was seeing it for myself when I would, on the occasion where I'd be in and out the office, in terms of people drinking in the streets, the litter from the plastic pint glasses. I was getting inundated with emails from members of the public community councils about things like street urination. These are not good things for the reputation of the city. They're not good things for the reputation of the trade. And it was clear that there was that link between takeaway pints and that aspect of public nuisance. And of course, it flies in the face of the city's bylaws, which are there for very good reasons, to prevent street drinking. And it was really that, regardless of the good intentions by licensed premises in selling takeaway pints, I think it was inevitable that these were not being purchased to take home, particularly in the way in which they were being sold in sort of plastic cups, that people inevitably were going to drink them on the streets. And I don't think that's an image that any of us really want to see. What we want to see is a return to our fantastic outdoor areas, our beer gardens, where people are enjoying having a drink outside, but under the right controlled circumstances.
The Kelvin Grove Park was actually shut off. I think you mentioned that. And one could see transit vans at all the entrances stopping people going in. I mean, and some of the behaviour that led to that. Police action was quite astonishing. I mean, just talking about the bylaw, I'm looking at it at the moment, any person that consumes alcoholic liquor in a designated place, which is, I think, 99% of Glasgow, apart from a carved out area wasteland, or is found to be in possession of an open container containing alcohol, he commits an offence. In Edinburgh, it's slightly different. I think the way that works is that the offence is committed if a police officer tells you not to do it. Yeah. Do it anyway. So
a couple of years ago, well, last year we did the review of the bylaws. Well, the council carried out the review of the bylaws, and we actually incorporated through the annual household survey questions about whether the public continue to support the bylaws, and it was a huge percentage. It was something like 89% come back in favour of retaining those bylaws. So it's something that local residents, the people of Glasgow, do feel very strongly about. But I think I'd be careful not to link all of the issues that we saw in the likes of Kelvin Grove Park with the on-trade. I think we all recognise that much of the alcohol that was probably being consumed within the parks was legitimately purchased as off-sales, which, you know, is very difficult to control the subsequent consumption of that alcohol. But I think when you see people hanging about directly outside the pub in which they've just purchased the takeaway pints, it is very easy to make that connection between that off sale and the street consumption of alcohol.
Yeah. During the so-called circuit breaker period, which in my experience was a particularly unhappy period, only licensed premises, the only licensed premises that could open were licensed cafes. And cafes was, the expression cafe was defined in the regulations, but there were all sorts of categorisation arguments, which I found, personally, I found that kind of really tiresome. And that was a point at which, and I'm not talking specifically about Glasgow by any means, where enforcement seemed to into overdrive. And I remember that the afternoon that the regulations were published, I think they came out at 1 o'clock, and I'm still reading them at 2:15, trying to work it all out. Another council was sending really threatening emails to people saying they'd be reported to the Procurator Fiscal. There would be a premises licence review, and there'd be a prohibition notice served on them. And that was just a bad period. I know we can't talk about individual cases, obviously, but what was your experience of Cafgate?
Yeah, I suppose it's interesting when you think back. Actually, the licensing board in their letter to the First Minister raised this issue about being concerned about how the cafe issue would be interpreted. And I think that the concerns which the board outlined in that letter then subsequently later that week came to fruition. And I think it was inevitable that premises would want to try and run the argument that they were a cafe. And I think my colleagues in environmental health had the very unenviable task of having to try and enforce those regulations. And I think, you've been in some discussions with my colleagues in environmental health. They have tried to be as pragmatic as possible, and they really have gone out of their way to try and support the trade, to keep premises open when it became a possibility of restrictions coming in earlier than they did, trying to show that the high compliance rates. But ultimately, they had that statutory duty to ensure that the regulations were being complied with, and they had to make decisions around those premises which they properly believed to be restaurants rather than cafes. But of course, one person's interpretation of that could be different from another's, and I really do think it did place them in a very, very difficult position. But I think possibly what wasn't picked up in the media so much is that the majority of the concerns that were being raised by environmental health were actually coming from licensed premises who had taken the difficult decision, obviously, to close, but they were seeing premises that would, on the face of it, appear to operate in the exact same way as them, remaining open and claiming to be a cafe. And I think that just made the situation very, very difficult. And perhaps maybe, as the board had suggested in their letter to the First Minister, it may have been easier a distinction to go with the premises selling could continue to remain open selling food, which is actually what we're seeing at the moment under the level, is anticipated under the level system, that premises can remain open, say for example at level 3, selling food but not alcohol, if the majority of the concerns were tied up with the impact that alcohol sales have on the behaviour of customers and the social distancing issues. So I think it was a real difficult one all round for licensed premises and those involved in the council and having to enforce those regulations.
I think that from a policy point of view, there was an element of madness there, because what was happening was that that unlicensed cafes who had none of the backstory about social distancing, about all sorts of enhanced hygiene measures, were rammed.
Yeah.
Were rammed, and you know, as one trade operator put it to me, he would pass them, and the windows would be steamed up.
Yeah,
you know, aerosol. So
I think we all recognise that licensed premises went to huge lengths to comply with regulations and all of the measures that they did put in place that probably aren't replicated in non-licensed premises. So I think people did struggle to see why an unlicensed restaurant could remain open selling food, but for example a licensed restaurant probably providing very similar food offer with probably enhanced COVID controls had to close. And I think that was a really difficult one for people to understand.
I don't think we'll see that again, that approach again, and that's a good thing. Inevitably, in the current situation, we've been falling back in technology, and your board and other boards too have been using video conferencing, and you use Microsoft Teams, of course. What sort of experience has that been like? You know, what have been the challenges it's posed, and is it working well for you?
I would say yes, but you know, I'm sure you'd probably agree. I miss the theatre, the drama of being in the Borough Court Hall. That almost sense of occasion that Licensing Board Fridays. I like to do my hashtag on Twitter. You know, I think we all almost look forward to those licensing board meetings, and part of it is the sort of drama of being there in person, just hearing and seeing the submissions, and sometimes the theatrics from the likes of yourself and others, and I think the board members as well. You know, it's quite an entertaining day. For those that maybe are very interested in licensing law, I'd probably caveat that with, which I don't think necessarily follows through on the Microsoft Teams meeting. I think it's more about getting the job done, focusing in on the key issues, which some people would say is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think the meetings are being done on Microsoft Teams by necessity, but I think given a preference, certainly myself and the board members would like to see a return when it's safe to do so to the Borough Court Hall for those full meetings. But I think there's probably questions about, does it actually increase accessibility to board meetings? Does it allow, for example, members of the public who have submitted objections or representations to access those meetings where they might not be able to do so for issues around childcare or work commitments? So there's maybe a model going forward for a hybrid style where, you know, we meet in person, but there's a possibility of either agents, objectors, or whatever, joining us remotely. And I think we've seen that with things like the Scottish Parliament, where, you know, you see MSPs joining remotely. So I think that's something that we do need to consider in future. But I'm certainly keen to get back into the Borough Court Hall and get my heels on to get dressed up.
I'm glad to hear that, because I think there are probably some boards, I mean, nobody's actually told me this in terms, who are so seized of the convenience of doing it that way that it might become a long-term thing. But yeah, I would hope not. I mean, it works well enough. I just find that, you know, as you say, you can miss the theatre. It's very sterile. Mm-hmm. I think that's the best way I can put it. You're kind of looking at, you know, a mosaic of faces on the screen, and so much is lost in that. So I'm glad to hear that we're both fans of, you know, doing it the traditional way. Mm-hmm. This is very topical. Premises licence fees due to be paid on the 1st of October by scores of businesses who are going to create a kind of getting blood out of stone experience, who've been shut down or substantially shut down since March. Now, I preface this question by saying that I've asked the Scottish Government about this. I've asked them as far back in May, when I could see what was likely to lie ahead. And, you know, I'm sorry to say, very little engagement in that at all, unlike in England, where the minister responsible for licensing wrote to boards, I have it here, or wrote to licensing authorities rather, back in April, saying, well, don't rush off and suspend licenses for non-payment if someone has got a case for, you know, making out that this is a COVID-19 related problem that they have. But the Scottish Government has, I thought, might have put out some more supplementary Section 142 guidance saying, think twice before you start revoking licences, which is the inevitable consequence of non-payment of fees in the normal.
Yes.
I suppose the question really is, what's Glasgow's position in collecting this money at the moment?
Yeah. So I think the board's approach to annual fees in general was that they wanted to reflect a reduction for the on-sales trade that have been hugely impacted by the COVID restrictions, the lockdown and the subsequent restrictions that have been brought into play. They have decided not to send out the fee notices to nightclubs this year, reflecting the fact that they have not been allowed to reopen, and that even under level 0, there is no timescale or plans for how they will reopen. In terms of other on-sales premises, the board instructed a 30% or a 1/3 reduction in the annual fees. But I think it was disappointing that there hasn't been more of a guidance issued by the Scottish Government, perhaps to see a bit more of a common approach across Scotland from licence boards in recognition. I know a number of my colleagues and other authorities and their boards have taken the view that they didn't have discretion around charging their full annual fee. We've obviously taken a slightly different approach with that 1/3 reduction in Glasgow. We actually extended the deadline for payment, which was just the end of November, so it was Monday of this week. So we're just in the process of working through those fees that have been paid, and we're probably looking at just over 50% of premises have paid their annual fees to us. So understandably, there is a large percentage of premises which haven't paid, and I think that is entirely understandable, particularly at the moment in a city under level 4 restrictions where premises are not trading and probably haven't had a viable trading period for a number of months. Where do we go with that? Well, my usual approach would be to write out to premises who haven't paid and say, well, on the basis that you haven't paid, does that mean you're no longer requiring your premises licence? You're no longer using that licence? So will we look to just take that off the system, which is a very effective way of bringing about payment. But we have no plans to do that this year. Now, obviously, we may have to look at collecting any unpaid amount when we send out fee notes next year. But hopefully by that point there will be a sustained period of recovery under the belts for premises, but we certainly won't be insisting upon payment at this time or looking to revoke or suspend licences in relation to non-payment. Where we have off sales that haven't paid, we will be following those up, because I think everyone would recognise that the majority of off sales have probably had a bit of a boom period with sales since the start of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that 50% figure I find surprisingly high. I think what's going to happen is the other 50% is going to be form a kind of hardcore of debt, if you like, that's going to be around for quite a long time. On the off-sale point, that's entirely well made. You might have an off-sale shop or a supermarket that's done rather well during the pandemic and is paying the maximum annual fee of £900. But then a hotel with a high enough rateable value is also paying £900 and it hasn't been open. Now, I don't think that was beyond legislative intervention. I really don't. And we did have Section 142 guidance from Scottish ministers fairly earlier on in relation to occasional licences, saying that, we need to support the trade at this difficult time and, paraphrasing, be flexible and be pragmatic in the way you go about it. So it's a bit of a mystery to me, frankly, that the same sort of approach hasn't been taken in relation to fees, and that the silence is more or less deafening. But that's not going to change. In previous videos, in a previous video, I was asked this question, and it's an interesting question. I'm going to be asking it of all the participants in this series as we walk through. It's what I'm going to describe as the ice cold on Alex moment. It's what, given all the horrific restrictions that we've been subject to for more or less 9 months now, there must be something in particular that we're looking forward to doing that we can't do at the moment. Mm-hmm. So what's your personal ice cold on Alex moment? What are you looking forward to most when this is all over?
Well, I think anybody who follows my Twitter or Instagram account will know that I like nothing more than getting dressed up, getting my heels on, getting my makeup on, and going out with the girls for a few cocktails. And I cannot wait until I can do that again, go out into Glasgow, go to our fab bars, restaurants, and just meet up with my friends and have a few cocktails and just enjoy ourselves, because it's been I think that's been, aside from obviously the really serious issues around COVID, I think that social interaction has been something that's been hugely missing from everybody's lives over the last 9 months or so. And I think that's the really important part that our hospitality, our licensed premises play, that it does bring people together. And I just can't wait until they're reopened and I can meet up with my friends and have a fantastic girls' day out in Glasgow.
Who would have believed a year ago that was an aspiration in December 2020? And also, the risk of making this sound even more depressing, it's impossible to guess at all when you would get your ice cold on Alex moment. It seems to be a continual pushback. Well, Easter, but I heard the other day somebody saying we'll hope to have a normal winter next year. Well,
I know. That's something I'm struggling with, I suppose, at the moment as well. We hear such positive news about vaccines, and I think there's almost an expectation that, if we're talking about the vaccine programme being rolled out really quickly, that we will start to see those relaxations and the restrictions and almost that return to normal. But I think we're hearing other messaging which suggests that we're facing restrictions throughout 2021 as well. And I think that's really, really disheartening. And I think we all just want to see some return to normality. Particularly in my job, I want to be going back to talking about regulating major events in the city. That's been such a huge part of my job over the last 15 years, about huge sporting events, cultural events. And I think that is really tied in with the success of our city centre. And I want to be doing all of that again. But at the moment, it's just unclear whether we will have that summer programme of events back on. But it's just, if only it was possible to have an end date in sight, I think it would keep us all going, that we knew that there was something that we're working towards. But I think, as has been said many times, nobody has that crystal ball as to how this is all going to pan out.
Well, indeed, because when it all kicked off, I had this kind of working assumption we'd be done by about November, latest, and we had to cancel the SLP conference that was due to take place at the beginning of June, and my thinking was, well, we'll do it in November. Then it was, we'll do it in March next year. And, I wouldn't put money in that. So we've got this, video content rolling now because it keeps us all in touch. We get to talk to each other and then, exchange views and hear what's happening in the board front as well. So thank you so much for that. It's been great to have you with us for this segment. And I'm sure we'll be having you back in the not too distant future as this.
It's always a pleasure, Jack.
Let's hope that we've got cheerier stuff to talk about next time round. So again, thank you so much. Thank you.
No problem. Lovely. Thank you.